Let's get started. Welcome back, everyone.
He's got his water.
Okay, did you get refreshed?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. We're going to have another session. I first want to acknowledge that Amy Jones will not be able to make it, so that's in your program, but it's a slight change. Instead, what we're going to have is Lynn Wooten coming up and bringing up a panel here to discuss some wonderful ideas. So Lynn was an associate dean here. We've lost her. She's gone on to Cornell, where she is dean. So please help me welcome Lynn Wooten.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Thank you for that welcome. It's always good to be back home, and I will always bleed maize and blue. So I have the opportunity this morning of really having this great interactive session based on 2 decades of research that I've done with my colleague Erica James, and we have a life case study. So many of the sessions in the last 2 days have been feel good, and what do you do to feel good and to be positive? And this is the same one, but this is really the hard work about how do you bring in positive organizing practices when you're managing and leading a crisis. And in particular, much of my research is focused on how do leaders and teams and organizations become resilient and renewal during and after a crisis. Okay, so my clicker's not working here.
Are they clicking from behind?
Sherry and the clicker here.
Not me.
Is it turned? Okay, let's see.
Would you like help with the,
No, I can do it there.
I can be your clicker over here if you like.
Okay.
Uh-huh. Really not working. Now that's one, Shane.
I did it. I put a shirt in.
Bear with us while we have a little technical difficulty.
Right.
Make sure I didn't disrupt any connections.
So in addition to myself, we have the honor of what we call a live case study here at Ross. And we have Thomas Grilk from the Boston Marathon, and he's going to be joining me on stage, so come on up, Thomas. And Thomas is going to introduce himself and tell a little bit about who you are and the case study you're going to be presenting.
My name's Tom Grilk from the Boston Athletic Association. I'm a recovering lawyer. Went to law school here in Ann Arbor.
Right? So he's a Wolverine too?
Where I met my wife, Nancy Frederick. I was a first-year law student moving into the law quad. Nancy was an undergraduate sophomore at Martha Cook Hall. I wandered into a mixer one night. Many years, very little conflict. Some children later, we're still going. So for us to come back here is engaging in a great many ways. And with what we went through in Boston, if there's an opportunity to share a little bit from that in a way that has some value to others, then one wants to do that. It says in your program that you'll hear a little bit about lessons of leadership and resilience and that sort of thing. I don't know if there'll be lessons, but there are some stories, and I hope they'll be of some value.
Thanks. So what the session's format is going to be is I'm going to introduce it and kick it off, and then Thomas is going to present his case study. And after the case study, we're going to have some generative dialogue where we actually integrate theory and practice. So I started studying crisis many years ago, like I said, 2 decades ago. And one of the things we discovered is that when you're in management, people don't usually train you how to deal with a crisis situation. Yet every day we go to work and something ambiguous might happen, we confront time pressures. There's organizational change that sometimes results in crisis. There are these sudden, shocking events that take you by surprise. And sometimes they're smoldering where they just grow over time crisis situations. Yet, when we have these difficult times, how do we lead in a crisis? What do we do? And more important, how do we show up and be our best self? Like the last session, how are we positive leaders in a crisis situation? In addition to all the factors about why we need to know about crisis leadership, when you survey organizations, most of them will say that, you know what, I'm a year away from a crisis. There's something that's going to happen on my organization, whether it be a college campus, my corporate setting, a government agency. 54% of those people say they have plans, and even the people who have these crisis plans, they say they're gaps or they don't think they're going to work. This Dilbert comic strip really captures it. Our disaster recovery plan goes something like this: help! Someday we hope to have a budget for it. Now, I know no one in this audience has an organization like that. You really have a plan, you've thought about leadership, but many of the organizations that I've worked with in the last 2 decades, Dilbert's perspective really captures how they think about crisis leadership. So when you ask leaders, whether it be the C-suite, middle management, or those on the floor, they feel very unprepared for crisis situations. They don't learn it in their formal education, they don't learn it in exec ed, there's not training on the job for it. So what happens is when a crisis hits, these behaviors happen. There's fear, there's denial, there's paralysis analysis, despair, anger, guilt. All of these things happen. And what are the consequences to these behaviors? Everything that we've been celebrating and talking about the last 2 days doesn't come into action. Leaders are not their best. They're not thinking about thriveness or wellness or resilience and renewal because they get stuck in these things such as anxiety or panic or guilt in a very reactive mode. One of our colleagues here, Jane Dutton, early on in her career talked about this as stress rigidity. And what Jane and Lance found out really is this notion of when you're facing a crisis situation, it not only are you not your best self, but you start to hoard resources. You become constrained. You don't know what to do with the information. Another one of our colleagues talks about sense making. And so by nature, crisis puts us in this constrained, resource, narrow mindset. Yet there are organizations that thrive in a crisis situation, that become better, that reinvent themselves. And that's what I've been interested in. And so the next hour or so, I want to take us on a journey about how do we have a paradigm shift. We're all in some way or another going to have to lead a crisis. It could be minor, major, smoldering, or sudden. But how do we think of a crisis as an opportunity to become a better person, a better team, and a better organization? So I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and he's going to present his case study of the Boston Marathon bombing.
But not without the clicker.
Yes.
Thank you. It's interesting, sometimes I have seen a presentation of a Chinese character for crisis made up of 2 little ideograms, one of which stands for crisis and the other for opportunity. But listening to what Lynn had to say about how organizations are paralyzed, is there anyone here who now wants to be a leader in crisis? You know, raise your hand. So what I'll do, if I may, is talk a little bit about dealing with crisis. I'll focus on 2 concepts. One, engagement. The other, preparedness. And if I may, I'll do it through a lens, a prism that I think is familiar to all of you, that of leadership. Because that's what you are, a group of leaders, or you wouldn't be here in the first place.
So we need to switch to your slides.
That's a very good idea. All right, we'll retreat a little bit here. All right, so if you would, looking at this as leaders, travel back with me in your mind's eye to April 15th, 2013, 5 years, 2 weeks, and 5 days ago. It was a magnificent day for a marathon, perfect weather. It was a great day to watch, and it was a great day to run, and that almost never happens. Everyone was having a terrific time. And then, at about 10 minutes to 3, 2 explosions rocked the finish area. 3 people are dead immediately. Hundreds of others are injured, many of them horribly, traumatic single and double amputations. 5,633 people have been stopped, and they can't get into the finish. You're in charge. What do you do? It's a day by which you and your organization may be measured more than by any other. And what happens, particularly for you as a leader, may follow you around for the rest of your life. Same question. You're in charge. What do you do? And as I think many of you will have observed, if you've been in broad situations in which trouble strikes in any of a number of areas of activity, what you can do as the leader is just about nothing at that moment, because what happens will be the result of tens or hundreds or thousands of individual interactions among people for whom you are responsible, but with whom you can't do a thing at that moment. So what's important? What do you need? Well, one of the things of which I spoke was preparedness. At the Boston Athletic Association, it may seem a little anal, but we have written protocols for decision-making under stress. They come down to about 3 things. If something bad happens, if you've got trouble you've got to deal with, number 1, focus on those people to whom we have the greatest obligation at this moment. And deal with those things and do those things that you can control. And try not to be too distracted by the things you cannot. And take care of those people then. And a minute later, somebody else. And 2 minutes later, somebody else. And it's happening all over the place. It gives people a level of preparedness that allows them to make decisions, gives them something to fall back on in a moment. In that moment, when something horrible happens, I have something I can fall back on. Who do I owe something to right now? Anybody know who this is? General Patton, George S. Patton, Jr. My father's commanding officer in the Second World War, though there was very little contact between them since my father was a 4-striped sergeant. And we think of Patton, if we've seen the movie, as kind of old blood and guts. He would tell people, you will do this, you will enjoy it, you will do it now. And you'll do it my way. But in fact, what my father told me was that what Patton drilled into people was quite different. He said, if you need something done, don't tell people how to do it. Tell them what you need and let them amaze you with their ingenuity. And we see that all the time. And we see it among people who are very, very engaged. We have spectators, we have volunteers, we have workers, we have medical people. One group right here, people who live along the course on the Boston Marathon, spectators who come out and take care of their people on their course no matter what happens. This is a picture from 2012 when there was deadly heat, 90 degrees almost in that race. I probably should have called it off. But people came out to take care of those runners. Why do they do that? Because in Boston, everyone owns the marathon, and they treat it that way. And we know those spectators will come do that. It's a constituency that's always there, that's been coming for generations. The Boston Marathon goes back to 1897. People keep coming out generation after generation, and they will do those things. They hose them on a hot day, and they have blankets for them on a cold day, like we had a couple of weeks ago. And then there are others. When horror happened, certainly the police and public safety authorities had to dive in right away. Had to do it with a construct, a level of preparedness. We have meetings leading up to the Boston Marathon every year that involve everybody. Public safety officials from all of the 8 cities and towns that comprise the race route, police, fire, emergency medical people, plus people from the state of Massachusetts, all manner of agencies, federal agencies, the FBI, Homeland Security, CIA, the FAA, the National Guard, all quarterbacked by a lead person from the Secret Service. And we have tabletop exercises, sort of sandbox exercises, to talk about what we would do if a certain scenario took place. and it happens multiple times a year. And we know that the probability is that none of those things that we game and talk about will happen. But we can presume that something will happen. And by going through that, people are prepared. They're ready for anything. Whatever happens, they've talked about it, they've thought about it, and they have that intellectual agility and the courage to do something because it sort of fits something that they have talked about. It's a high level of preparedness, a level of engagement in these people that is the same as we saw in those spectators. And then there are volunteers. When the marathon got stopped in 2013, 5,633 people couldn't get down to the finish line, and they couldn't get their medal. And getting the medal is a big, big deal for people. The Boston Marathon is really hard to get into. Outside of the Olympic Games, it's the only marathon in the world for which you have to qualify, and it's really hard. You have to be at about the top 10 or 15% performance-wise in your age group. And every year, about half the field are first-timers. There are people who have been working for a long time to get there. When they get there, they want to do it, and they want to get that medal. And David Ortiz got up and said, "We're not going to let those bums ruin our lives, because it's our effing city." And that resonated a long way. He could do it. But it expressed a spirit that's been around Boston for a long time, a sense among people that they will live their lives the way they want, the way they choose, no matter what anybody does, to try to stop it. The slogan that went around was Boston Strong. But that's really what it was all about. People who were not going to let anything stop them from what's important. And it continues. Here's a picture from this year's race. The conditions were wretched. A huge storm blew in from the Atlantic Ocean with gale force winds, heavy, heavy rain, temperatures in the mid to upper 30s, low 40s, 3 to 6 degrees centigrade, right in the runners' faces all the way. That's what they look like at the end, a bunch of druids just trying to get warm. But volunteers, 95% of them showed up. One of the things I worry about most if the weather is awful is, will the volunteers turn rational on us and stay home? Or will they come back? Because they come back every year at a 90+% rate. The same people, year after year after year, engaged, committed people, and they did. And they stood out there in the freezing temperatures to take care of their runners in their finish area in this case and give them bananas. And when it turned out that the runners' fingers were too frozen to peel the bananas, another display of a measure of initiative that nobody could tell someone to do because they're prepared and they're engaged. Just awful. Here's some poor devil standing at the start with a howling wind. He can't even pick up the trash because it's blowing away. But out there with the other 9,500 volunteers who were out there doing it that day, not giving up, not giving in, and never surrendering the spirit that carries them forward. Here are these knuckleheads hours into this. And that's their reaction. How do you suppose the runners feel when they see that? Are they in the hands of people who can deal with crisis, who will take care of them? Pretty obvious answer. But the real, if one is to look for the most compelling, professionally and emotionally speaking story out of it all, it comes in the medical tent back in 2013 on that day of horror. That's medical tent A. It's not very far from the finish line. It's a big, big tent. It's got about 200 cots in it, plus areas for warming people if they need it, plus areas for ice baths for people. There's another tent, same size, not very far away, because it turned about 6 blocks down, because it turns out a lot of people go down a little later, and that tent actually gets fuller. But this is the one that had to bear the brunt of the horror in 2013, when those explosions happened. 3 people, 3 precious lives were lost immediately. Nothing could be done. But for the other people who were injured in modest ways, and in some cases in horrible ways, they were brought into that tent, a tent that's there to deal with runner discomfort. Somebody hurts their ankle, strains their knee, too hot, too cold, they didn't drink enough water, They drank too much water. But on that day, it was instantly transformed into a major trauma center, such that every person who came in, no matter how grave their injury, was in there, triaged, attended to quickly, gotten to the other end of the tent where the ambulances are, and put in an ambulance and sent to the right hospital with the right specialty for their injury, and where the load of patients was such that it could be taken care of. And that all happened in 29 minutes. How do you get people like that? 3 days later, President Obama came to Boston. He conducted an interfaith service at a cathedral, and then he wanted to meet volunteers. So we gathered up a bunch of volunteers at the high school gymnasium adjacent to the cathedral. This isn't going to go well. You can see in my face the emotion as I stood there and said, Mr. President, the people you just met, the volunteers in those yellow jackets and the white medical jackets, we had to give them new ones this morning, because the ones they wore on Monday are too bloody. But those are the people who behave in the ways that one can only dream of in that kind of a crisis. As a leader, what do? You work with people to establish a vision, you specify objectives, you train, and then you trust, because you can't be there when they have to do all the things that they do. And what they did was magnificent. So that night, the police said, we've got a line on the killers. We think we can find these scoundrels. We think we know where they are or where they're going. And so what the governor of Massachusetts and the mayor of the city of Boston did was say, look, folks, everybody, stay home. Tomorrow morning, don't go to work. Stay home, leave the streets clear so the police can do what they have to do. And you know what happened? Nobody went out. Nobody. It was like a ghost town all over Boston, Cambridge, Watertown, where they were finally caught. The American actor Adam Sandler tweeted out, Boston may be the only major city where if you F with them, they will close the whole city, shut it down, and find you. And that's exactly what happened. One brother killed the other brother, and the other one was taken into custody and is in a supermax prison right now. And what happened when all that was over? All those people, those sort of Boston strong people, came out of their houses. Not all of them spent a lot of time cheering for the police, but it was like a parade. People came out and cheered the police all the way through Watertown, back through Cambridge to Boston, wherever they were going. There's another expression of that resilience and of the engagement that all of them have displayed, because the attack was on them, was on everybody. We at the Boston Athletic Association went silent for about 3 weeks, because it wasn't an attack on us. It was an attack on the city of Boston, on freedom, on a whole lot of abstract things. Those people came out to cheer because their values were being upheld. So this year, when we had this ghastly day, and it was horrible, the chief of the Boston Emergency Medical Service said that it was the highest misery index in the history of the race. So when I stood there at the finish line with a colleague looking up the street toward the horizon in the puddles with 30,000 people about to come over that horizon, I knew that those 30,000 people were going to be okay. We both did. Because all of those people who were out there, those people along the way whom I describe, are, always have been, always will be, Boston strong, engaged, prepared, committed. It's a remarkable place to be. Thank you for your kind attention. We go here.
Before I I continue, I think we have a video that we can cue up, Tom, that gives us the state of the organization today.
Oh,
Yes, the video.
yes, ma'am.
Yes. You want to say anything about the video?
The video is not this year's marathon, because I think all the cameras got soaked and hasn't been compiled yet. But this is last year's Boston Marathon, and what I think may give you a sense for is just the exuberance that surrounds this thing, that begins to explain the antecedents for the kind of behavior that I was describing. So, Captain, video.
Video.
It starts where it does here now, because that's where the railroad went in its day. And they stopped at each of the towns along the way, all the way into the city, the 8 towns.
Huge field of over 30,000. Start here at Hopkinton. And we have had a major separation.
Down to 6 athletes in the front.
Meanwhile, Edna Kiplagat has put the hammer down.
She's got 550 meters to go.
Uh-oh. Galen Rupp has been dropped.
It's sensational performance by Joffrey Karui.
And Edna Kiplagat is your 2017 Boston Marathon Women's Champion. Karui knows he's got enough distance to salute the crowd. 2:09:37.
The prop that I brought up but didn't show you because I forgot came from our friends at Adidas, who are a sponsor of ours, and they did this days after the 2013 Boston Marathon. And what it says here is Boston runs as one. And that expressed the general sense of engagement everywhere. And for those of you from Michigan, this year in the marathon, in those horrible, miserable conditions, was won by a young lady from Michigan, the first American winner since another lady from Michigan. Desiree Linden trains in Rochester Hills and came and won the race. The last person to win it as an American woman was Lisa Larson-Weidenbach back in 1985, who was educated at
Michigan.
University of Michigan.
Thanks a lot, Tom.
Oh, sure.
As you were listening to the case study, and now we do some reflection, I have 3 questions, and then I'm going to ask you to take a couple of minutes to pair and share with your neighbor. The first question is, when you think about crisis, and especially the exemplary case study that we heard, how in crisis situations do you build upon strengths? Do you expand them at the individual, team, and organizational levels? Secondly, how do you get into capability building? When you think about crisis situations and building capabilities, we often think about just resolving the crisis. But how do you increase capacity, effectiveness, organizational learning? And then finally, what does leadership look like? You think about the Boston Marathon and the clips that Tom showed us. Everything from volunteers to the first responders to the administration to the President of the United States flying in. What are actually specific actions of extraordinary behaviors that we can use in crisis situations? So, I want you to take 2 minutes with your neighbors and think about the Boston Marathon case study or other great crisis situations that you may have read or observed. And how do they demonstrate a paradigm shift for managing and leading in crisis where we really do see them as opportunities for renewal and resilience? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to chat with your neighbors, get energies up, make some high quality connections, and then I'm going to ring the chimes. Okay. I know, I can't get... So Angie has the speaker that we throw out, and I have a volunteer that's going to throw it. I want to hear about 3 or 4 conversations and what you discussed. What ideals came up, what emerged. This is a hard topic. It's easy to be positive when things are good, right? But in crisis situations, so can I have a volunteer to talk about, I know you were talking because I heard you. So you have to have some ideals. It wasn't silence. Here, and the balcony up there.
I do not trust my throwing arm for this.
Go ahead, come on, be tough. Oh, yeah!
Nice throw. Nice throw. I think we broke it. Oh, no, we got it. So, all right. So my name is Aurelio Doris, and I'm with Urban Ashes. When we spoke about the crisis, for me, The thing that came to mind is at the age of 17, after a traumatic life, I made a very poor decision, and I was arrested. And at 17, I was ultimately sentenced to 27 to 40 years in prison, out of which I served 24 years. I think at that period, to me, that served as a crisis. The very first thing that I had to do was I had to ask myself, is there anything immediate that I had to address, about that situation? And then I had to reassess all of my life, all of my thinking up until that point, and see where it is that I can begin to change my perceptions, my interpretations, and generally my entire cognitive process. And that led to cognitive restructuring, which over a decade and a half later allows me to be able to catch other people that's headed toward that path before they hit the wall of crisis.
Thank you for sharing.
Urban Ashes, one of the companies that won the competition we're going to talk about later, that's the company he's talking about. Okay?
Oh, thank you. One more volunteer before we move on. One in the back there. Great job, Jeremy.
Thanks, really touching story. My name is Shane Metcalf. I'm with 15.5. And what came up for me in the contemplation of this whole story is that if companies actually care about the whole person, and people feel that, the employees feel that my whole self is welcome at this company, then if a crisis happens, I'm going to care about the whole person of the other people going through that crisis. I no longer see them as just as my coworkers, I see them as human beings. And that's when I will step up, I will get out of my own insecurities and fears of helping and actually rise to the occasion.
This whole person is caring. So we had one example of a cognitive mindset and changing and reframing the situation. And you're right, the Boston Marathon exemplifies that. They care about Boston, they care about the marathon, and everybody was willing to show up and work through the crisis situation. Thanks. Any more before I move on here? Last one. Oh, good. Over here. Oh, can you throw it over here? Can you throw it to her? Do you want it? I think we need some Boston baseball.
Well, what I liked from what was shared was having your strategy, a crisis strategy. And that's the most you can do is just have the strategy and prepare it. So a couple of years ago, actually maybe just over a year ago, our organization lost an employee in a horrible car accident. And it was all the things surrounding that. And we all knew from the news and all of us talking, 400 people talking about what was going on. But the leaders didn't talk about it for a week. And I thought that was way too long. I thought the organizational leaders should have said, there's some information that is going around that was unsubstantiated. We can't say anything just yet, or something. And they didn't do that. But we'll pass this office, and this person didn't show up, and didn't show up, and didn't show up. So that's what I learned. It's like you can't know what's going to happen, but you can prepare people. And that was very devastating for like 400 people because we're a very small organization and we all know each other. So that's what I learned today, that at least you can do is prepare and have a strategy.
Thanks a lot.
I like
the
that.
Preparation. So there are two things I want to accomplish with the remainder of our session. I briefly want to share you a research perspective about what we know about crisis leadership. And then I want to do what I call a celebrity interview with Tom and tell him to say, you know what, Lynn, you've wasted 20 years of research. This is how it really happens. So I want to challenge him. As I said, my colleague Erica James and I started in the PhD program studying crisis when we were here as students. And we wanted to develop a theory really about how do you go from kind of just saying, I'm surviving in the crisis, to managing in the crisis, to leading in the crisis. In other words, we wanted a positive deviant perspective to crisis leadership. When are organizations at their best? When are they thriving? Often when I think of positive deviance, it's almost when you go to the doctor's, right, and you're feeling good and you ask the doctor, how can I be better? We wanted to study those organizations that were outliers in crisis situations. So, and then like I said, it started right when we were in the PhD program and then our first assistant professor appointment. And so it's been more than 2 decades where we collected extensive qualitative data through actually being on site, interviews, and content data, studying over 100 organizations. Our sample of organizations in our database include organizations that have experienced what we call sudden crises like the Boston Marathon, natural disasters, when things aren't explained. But we also study a lot of smoldering crises, just bad behavior in organizations. In particular, one stream we've studied is discrimination lawsuits. And we use this process methodology of spending hours and hours going through the data to understand how organizations respond in crisis and looking for that positive deviant behavior. So we would identify crisis situations, we would analyze the behavior and the stakeholders engaged in that behavior. We would start at the crisis, but we would look at the organizations over time. Then after they resolved the crisis, we would go back year after year to understand the post-crisis behavior. In particular, how did they learn from the crisis? How did the organization improve? How did the organization become resilient? And so we developed this model, and this is the managerial version of the model. Then we have a theoretical version of the model. So what we found is that an organization, when we all face crisis, we go into this shock. And so there's this initial shock. I talked about the denial, the paralysis, the hiding under the table. One of the favorite ones we talk about is the people who see no evil, hear no evil. I didn't know what was happening in my organization. Then there's this corresponding behavior. At first they say the crisis didn't happen, or we didn't know anything about it, this is wrong, or something like that. After the organization realizes, yes, I do have a crisis, and they get over this initial psychological and behavior shock, they go into management mode. This is when you see the attorneys come, the chief marketing officer, the communication. There's all this reactive stuff. General counsel comes in and solves it. It's the damage control phase. But in our mind, in our research, that wasn't what we saw as the positive deviant behavior. That's just the baseline of how you manage the crisis. The organizations that thrived, that learned, that became better, what we identified, actually went through these 6 various behaviors. Starting with, okay, you have this crisis situation, so you have to demonstrate quick and ethical decision making. While you're engaging in this quick and ethical decision making, you do have to scan your environment, internal and outside, to see what are the resources. What can I do to help me resolve the crisis? The other big things about it was building trust. Tom talked about that. One of our colleagues in the audience, if the organization has trust with its stakeholders, they're better able to manage the crisis. And then once you get through that phase, the behaviors that our research identified were important was the organization's ability to learn, its ability to take a high payoff mentality, and in these crisis situations, think about opportunities to be better. And I'm going to ask Tom about that in a few minutes. What were the opportunities that emerged? So quickly, when we talk about quick and ethical decision making, what did it look like in our positive deviant organizations? One is that they realized the organization was vulnerable. So similar to what Tom said, they planned for it, they prepared for it, but at the end of the day, there's so much preparation you could do. Yet they were constantly looking for the vulnerability spots. They had a moral compass. Ethics was involved. This is how we treat our customers, this is how we treat our employees and our other stakeholders. The third bullet point is maybe one of the harder ones. You have to address the elephants in the room. And if you're conflict avoidant like me, that's hard. Thinking about what's uncomfortable. How am I going to bring it out? How am I going to solve the problem? The other ones talk about making sure your systems are working, making sure the organization develops a memory, and using data. If you got to be quick, you have to say, show me the data. Many of them had data to say what's causing the crisis and how I can resolve it. One of the favorite ones that we looked at was, and that you would never think of this, it's unusual to think of this organization as positive, deviant in the way, is during Hurricane Katrina, Walmart beat the first responders there. And the reason why they beat the first responders there was because they had extremely good data from the last hurricane in Florida, and they knew the hurricane was coming, they had learned from it, and they knew what supplies you needed. Surprisingly, the two most important supplies that people wanted to buy in a hurricane, they found out, were water and Pop-Tarts. Don't ask me why, but they had plenty of them, right? But they had developed that organizational memory from their whole supply chain managing hurricanes and natural disasters. And then sense-making behavior is very important too. So after this quick and ethical decision-making, or really in the same time in tandem, part of it is building trust and respect. Many of you, Tom, you talked about trust building. The people in the audience, I heard them talk about trust building. And it came in many forms what we look for. Now remember, when Erica and I graduated from the PhD program, this was 1994. This is before social media. So we actually, over the last 2.5 decades, have been able to see how communication strategies have changed. And some of our most popular work is about really using social media to communicate in a crisis. Communicate, communicate, communicate. One of the things I'm going to ask Tom is how many channels of communication they were going to use. Back when I started this research, if you could get on headline news, that was good enough, or your local news. Now you have to think about webs and blogs and social media and people responding and then people tweeting and co-creating communication, but communicating over and over again. And so looking at patterns of communication. And then some of the trust principle, another one of our colleagues from the PhD program, Anil Mishra, what we found is there's a lot of literature on trust, and we went deep into the trust, and this kind of simplifies it in the leadership way. When you're in a trust situation, this ROC model applies. Being reliable. Can people believe what you're saying? You're going to do what you're going to say, and you're going to deliver. Everybody wants you to be reliable. The O is for open. You don't want to lie. Try as best as possible, as general counsel will let you, tell the truth. It's so important to build the trust that way. The C is competent. None of us can think about, if we were at the Boston Marathon, do we want incompetent people running the organization? How do you ensure you have competent people? You invest in training, development, empowerment, and organizational learning so that when the crisis situation occurs, I'm sure that Tom has lots of volunteer training and things. What do you do for your volunteers to make sure they're competent in your team, Tom?
Well, there are high degrees of training usually done by their area of work. There are volunteer captains for hydration, right, for medical, for food distribution, for metal distribution. And through them and through video, they are trained on what's coming and what some of the exciting things may happen that no one expects.
Right. And you said use video training too.
We do.
Y'all see technology change. The last one is demonstrating compassion, and we have a couple of good case studies. One of the favorite one is how Mattel handled the lead crisis when the toys had lead, and how the CEO showed compassion and reached out to parents about their trying to do everything. Another one that's not so favorite is we did in-depth studies of the BP crisis, and if anybody remembers how the CEO goes, you know what, I'm just tired, I want to go home and go to sleep. Yeah. You know, you're dumping oil in the water, and no one cares if the CEO wants to go home and go to sleep. So demonstrating compassion is very important. Thirdly, our research indicates this notion of scanning to see possibilities. In crisis situations, life is hard. But individuals, teams, and organizations many times have the resources, the strengths. They have that power in them to think about how I'm going to resolve the crisis situation. So a lot of times when we're working with organizations, we ask them to think about this context map here. What's inside your organization that you can use or did you use for the crisis situation? What's happening in your political environment or your economic environment if it's a smoldering crisis? Who are your outside partners? The Chilean mining case, which is one of the cases we have in our database, is a great example of how they partnered with people. So for example, they partnered with NASA to understand how the miners could live in tight spaces for 30 days and use that particular knowledge. How can you use technology? What are the customer needs? So you have to constantly have this inside-outside mindset. If you think about the Boston Marathon, they were thinking about the volunteers, the people who work in the organizations, but they had to have a very big space of outside partners and seeing the possibility. Probably my favorite part of what I like to study about crisis leadership is how organizations learn. I really just love to understand how organizations and individuals learn. And every organization that we observe that was positive deviance engaged in learning. This learning wasn't something new. They probably came with learning agility before the crisis, but in crisis mode, they took it up to another notch. So when we talk about organizational learning, we think about it at the personal level, the ability for the team to learn, and then for organizations to think systemically and systematically. One of the case studies that we use is we use the landing on the Miracle at the Hudson River, and we talk about the pilot and the flight crew, and even how the Coast Guards that day all engaged in organizational learning to make sure that that flight was safe. At the personal level, when you think about the pilot, he had personal mastery of crisis and flying. He was a retired military pilot. And, I like to play Scrabble to keep my brain up. His brain exercise, what he would do is he would do flight simulations and crisis situations in his spare time. That would be his brain exercise to keep himself sharp. When you hear the crew talk, they indicate that the team learned together. The flight attendants and the pilot all came into action mode when they realized they were the crisis, the same way as they were ready in the Coast Guard. And then they had this kind of shared value and systems approach about how they were going to land that plane and ensure that the passengers were safe. Now, I said earlier, this is the hard thing here. How do you think about an opportunity in a crisis situation? You're miserable, like you were saying about the weather. You're stressed. You're in paralysis. You're in denial. The ability to think about opportunity comes in many forms. And one day, Erica and I were sitting there and we just decided we're going to brainstorm, spell out the word opportunity, and think about what are some of the things you can do in crisis situations that really shift the mindset, that change the paradigm and opportunities. And there's everything from organizational learning to making sure your team has a cohesive experience, to making sure you have stakeholder support, to investing in your reputation, to even changing technology. The classic case is think about how the Tylenol scandal was an opportunity to change the industry for safety. And then finally, this notion of having a high payoff mentality. There are two things for a high payoff mentality. One is to have a long-term view. The crisis will pass. And so how do you leverage those insights? How do you learn from the crisis? How, as a leader or a manager, do you position the organization for the future or change? The iconic case study that we've been using recently in our database for this one is how Chipotle totally reinvented their food safety processes after the food contamination they had. They started to work with their suppliers, their vendors, their customers. Not surprisingly, you can imagine right now we're tracking the Starbucks case with the incident that happened in Philadelphia. And to have this high payoff mentality, you have to invest in collaborative relationships. Remember, in no crisis, you're not stuck on an island. Nothing is silo. Think about those most important stakeholders that are involved and bring them in as you're trying to produce this positive deviant behavior. So at this point, we have about 5 or 6 minutes. Like I said, I've just been stuck in the Ivy Tower studying this. So we have this expert here, Tom. And we will also take questions from the audience. But just to get some start-off questions, Tom, first one is, what is theory you think missing about crisis leadership? What would you like to add if I was to build upon the theory I presented?
I'd focus on people.
People,
You
yes.
need to have a few people who, I don't know how to say this and make it sound good, who thrive on that kind of situation, who see something happening and it brings them to life. There are some people, and when it happens, you have some people that are paralyzed, as you say. You have to kind of give them some place to go and focus on the people who thrive when that happens, who are, this sounds even worse, exhilarated by it. There's something to do here. Nancy and I have a son who saved somebody's life in a hugely dangerous weather situation when no one else would move. He thought, I can do something here. There was that exhilaration. So there's a personal component to it, and you have to know who you're working with.
Focus on people. Additional things you think we should think about with regards to this theory and what really works in the real world?
Boy, for the terms preparation and engagement that I was focused on are the things that are most important to me with in a way, engagement being number one.
Engagement.
You get a lot of people who care. They'll behave above average. They will be positive deviants.
Yep. Down at the leadership role, as you rolled up your sleeves and you reflect upon the experience, what's the most important advice you have for leaders on the day-to-day of leading in a crisis?
Well, plan for trouble.
Plan for trouble.
Plan substantively, but plan as an engagement matter, and whether you're engaging people to be effective in crisis or engaging them to be effective in daily business, which is a lot of what we've heard here. How do you engage them? And engage them on the things that they're best at. We heard talk yesterday about being spiky. We're going to go for the things where people are good. Jan said, don't waste time being a little better at the things you're bad at and then diminishing the things you're good at. Drive the things people are good at. That's been a real good thing for me to focus on sitting here.
Do we have questions from the audience for Tom? Anybody in the audience have any questions? Right here. That's an easy throw.
So I would ask one question about the corporates. I remember first, global launch I did was Windows 95. And we were trained, because they half year before that, Intel did this floating, dot problem, whatever. There was a big, huge corporate problem they've got. So we were trained how to avoid in communication such crisis. Now, what happened in Germany with Volkswagen, it looks like they are not learning corporates, or Samsung with the phone. Do you think that the corporates are learning enough how to not only the crisis, how to communicate around the crisis, A, and how much is it done, and I don't want to pick up on the nations, but on the German or Korean mentality?
Yeah, so in general, if we look at Volkswagen, when they had trouble with the diesels and they were lying and people were criticizing them heavily, as one who has been a corporate general counsel, and we've heard about them suppressing everything, see if we can get those scoundrels to allow you to speak. To me, the most difficult factor in those things is that people don't want to admit that something went wrong.
Yeah.
If you can say, whoops, I got that wrong. Shouldn't have, but I did. Individually as an organization, there is nothing more important. As a lawyer, I've been through some things that were very difficult for people, and it never gets better until people admit there's a problem and talk about it.
First of all, I just want to say how inspiring this. I'm from Boston. And I loved the way that you told the story. It was really powerful. But
Thank you. It's a great story to be able to tell.
Being from Boston, I'm curious about the role of positive identity of a community and thinking about, what has been the role of, the sports, just generally in Boston and sort of in what unfolded in the case of the marathon. So I would love to have you speak to that.
Yeah, there's a bit of an edginess to people in Boston. I've heard it said that the three principal areas of enthusiasm are sports, politics, and revenge. And so with that, and I'm going to use a bad word here, but I heard someone do it, so maybe I can get away with it. There is a kind of a collective sense that we're not going to take any shit off of anybody. Right. And it comes through, often in positive ways, sometimes in not so positive ways. But it's a place where this notion of we will live our lives the way we choose no matter what isn't new. It goes back 250 years to the American Revolution. So there is a character to communities, and that's a big part of it there.
We have a question behind you, or someone else has the mic.
I had a question regarding part of the preparation. I mean, you went through scenarios and everything, but do you also think that part of the preparation was having a shared vision of how we took care of the runners, how we took care of the people, and that actually had an effect on how people responded when the crisis occurred?
Well, I'm sure that's true. I spoke of it using the term engagement, but yeah, people come out of their houses. When those 5,633 people got stopped, the people in the Back Bay section of Boston came out, took them into their houses if either they needed something physically or they were just rattled emotionally when they found out what was going on. So having that level of engagement, sort of personal ownership, is more important than anything, I think, because people will amaze you with their ingenuity and their initiative.
A slightly different question. In a corporate setting, when a crisis happens, there's a bunch of people that want to know what's going on. So in this case, you were able to delegate authority, you were able to trust that people will go do what's right for the moment. In a corporate setting, they may be, the board wants to know what's going on, the shareholders want to know what's going on. So would you do anything differently in this kind of a situation?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last bit.
Would you do anything differently if it were, a big crisis in a corporate situation?
Well, would we do anything differently in that one? Yeah, in all of these things, where do the learnings come from? In part, they come from inspiration and people analyzing what's needed. Very often, they come from things that didn't go well. So we didn't. In that case, the transportation of some people off the course wasn't as good as it should have been. So it got a whole lot better this year in miserable weather as you learn from those things. But again, in dealing, back on my legal side, corporate side, in dealing with boards of directors and particularly shareholders, just tell them the truth. Just let them know what's going on. Because the longer you wait, the worse it gets. And there does often seem to be an instinct to do that. No one wants to screw up this quarter. And it doesn't work.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that is it. I want to thank you for this session. I'd like to close up with some music, so I'm going to ask Sherry to cue up the music here. One of the things that energizes me about studying positive deviance crisis situations is it really requires us to rise up. And so we're going to play as our departing thought the song Rise Up, and thank you.